We're going to talk about how to build a story from customer feedback. And as a little bit of a starting point, the way we compiled this and kind of got to this point was through a lot of conversations with our customers, with users, with other non-customers and people throughout the insights and um, customer analytics and customer experience community. So I think what you're seeing here is in many ways um, a synthesis and kind of an encapsulation of a lot of those different conversations, and we will go through those. So the goal of what we're going to talk through is really the best practices of what that story looks like. Um, Kind of when we talk about what a story is, I think there's a kind of a few different ways that commonly this kind of manifests itself in an organization, whether it's um, what we sort of term as like cadence-based reporting, regular readouts, presentations that you're doing on a specific, whether it's quarterly, monthly, very sort of sequence-based. There's ad hoc analysis where maybe a business leader comes to you with a specific question that they want answered. So it might be something like, I've seen this in the business. Can you go find me information on this or pull insights on it? And then the last one is more around um, specific creation of a business case to drive change. And there's probably a lot of overlap between these. Um, and depending on the organization, you may call them different things. So how are we specifically going to get there? How are we going to talk about this in the context of our time today? Really, three different things, three different steps. The first one is this idea of setting the foundation. The story is really built first in the foundation, and that's through the concept of defining the audience and building the right focus or setting the right focus. And we'll talk about that. The second one, or the second key step is obviously, okay, crafting the insight themselves. We'll talk about, we've heard a lot, and we certainly at Thematic talk about actionable insights, but we did get a lot of interesting perspectives from our customers and some other people about what does actionable really mean, as well as relevant. This idea of relevant insights was important. And then lastly, the final, close or the case, the process of this messaging and the call to actions. What does that look like? Okay, so the first step is this foundational element. And the first thing we talked about, or the first thing that came through and really consistently in every one of our conversations, was this concept of knowing the audience. And we have kind of simplified this into a couple critical groups, and I'm not necessarily going to go through all the groups of the questions, but the common thread that came through from all the leaders who have presented to all levels was basically this really key step of audience identification, and then using that to build the right message, to understand the stakeholders, the blockers, understand the metrics that matter to those individuals, and really use that as a formulation point for everything else. That was really the primary step in this process, was just understand before I build anything, before I go down any road of insight development, I have to understand who's the decision maker, who are the influencers, who do those people look to, who are the blockers in this chain, who do I need to change, and then understand all of those different processes all of those different people have different levers that they can pull and different metrics and KPIs that they maybe need to go after. So the next piece here after audience identification was this idea of focus. And this is one I think was a little bit new to me. It definitely came out pretty consistently, particularly in a lot of our more data heavy research and technology customers, was the idea that setting the right guardrails. And this is actually pre-data. So this is not after we get the data and we're trying to set the right focus on what we analyze once we're looking at it. But this is before. This is going back to the stakeholders and setting the right parameters of these are the types of things we're going to look at. And really critically, to be able to say, the objective that we're doing is to inform a specific business decision. What is the business decision that we're trying to do? We're trying to inform, to choose the data sets we're going to look at, to basically say, these are the things we're going to rule out. And there was a really critical call out from somebody in one of our technology customers who said that, there's this desire a lot of times because the skill level and the aptitude and the desire of people who take these roles is to oftentimes be really fascinated by data, to want to chase all of these different nuances and things they discover, grab more data sets, but that there has to be a proper process upfront to basically define what is in scope and out of scope. So audience definition and maintaining focus upfront, really, really critical. Okay, so what we're going to do is actually run through a little bit of an example of what this might look like based upon what we've learned so far, and what we're about to learn in stage 2. And our audience in this case is product, and we're going to talk to the head of product. We're going to talk through, first of all, their goals. Part of this was identifying the audience, setting the parameters, understanding what their goals are. And in this case, they're looking at a Q2 readout, probably even something more monthly and granularly around critical insights for roadmap areas. Those roadmap areas are really sort of transferable to any industry, whether it's business priorities, really things that are essential to that team. They've already defined them. The second thing that they're interested in is any emerging themes of interest that we can identify over the last few months. This is something we've presented before, we've talked about, and so the product team is interested to say, is there anything else we know outside of our core roadmap areas that would be interesting for us to understand? And then the last goal of the presentation or the readout to them is any critical product issues, right? With the product team, these sort of functionality and usability things are sort of like always on, bugs, breaks. Is there anything that that team needs to understand that kind of flows outside the roadmap? So what is the roadmap? Well, we're actually going to be looking at an app review data set for Zoom today, which is really timely. We're all in Zoom. And the roadmap for them is virtual background, mobile functionality, and education. And really with the education, it's mostly long-term tracking. So it's not that critical to them in the short term. Even for this purpose of our presentation, we're actually really going to focus on virtual background. For the emerging themes, we want to understand is, can we align those to any of the roadmap areas? So it'll be even a bigger win if we can identify emerging themes that align to the roadmap. For product issues, again, usability, and then we want to close with a call to action. Okay, so really quickly, we'll talk through this. Crafting the insights. So we talked about actionability. Some interesting call outs here is that actionability, one of the things that shined through from our conversations was this starts prior to the analysis itself, and it's understanding, what are the motivators of those decision makers and stakeholders. Actionability really resides in what are the things they want to accomplish, right? So it's not necessarily what does the data say, and looking at the data and saying these are the things the data says can be moved, but it's the things that the business says we should do these things. It's the individual people who are managing the business. where you have gone through the scoping process or the process of understanding that these are the priorities of these individuals that say, we actually are focusing on these things, we should do these things, therefore bring me insights about these things, rather than just presenting me insights that may on the surface seem actionable, but they're actually not going to be acted upon. The last bullet we thought was really interesting in that it's this idea that if we can connect feedback to metrics that are really trusted by the organization, it will make the feedback and the insights easier to connect. It'll make the insights easier to trust by those individuals, but it will also easily correlate or connect to their impact, because whether it's financial or operational, those other metrics already have resonance, and so they don't need to make such a leap to understand them. Another piece here, which came through from another one of our technology customers, was really interesting idea about how relevancy is built. So actionability was more around where can the feedback be, where can the data be actioned in the business. Relevancy was more about how do we make it punchy and sticky to the actual person we're trying to influence. And for them, it was all about connecting it to quotes that relate to the business. In this case, it was a really interesting piece of feedback that a lot of times to them, his stakeholders, in this case, it was a product environment, weren't even as much interested in the hard data as they were the stories from customers and connecting those with the things they were already working on. Those anecdotes and stories and feedback was really essential. And he viewed himself very much like a curator of the customer feedback rather than an analytics person who's just providing data. This is a really interesting perspective. Okay, so we are going to go back to here. And now what we're going to do is going to talk through how we could package and present this up. So as we talked about in the beginning, the readout or the process here is to do a readout back for our product team, in this case, our head of product. And the big question for them was, can I look at Q2 or perhaps something more recent? The action item we wanted to start with was we could first try and look at this month. And we think that's probably the best step given the way that the business is changing pretty rapidly. And in particular, we talked about the number one roadmap item being virtual background. And so in order to get that, I can actually really quickly go into this theme search box, look at virtual background, and I can see that this is a component of functionality. And here are all the different functionality items that the product team has already identified. And so the nice thing that Thematic is doing here is that we've worked with a product team, and these are all core product items. Many of these already have a product manager attached to them. And in this case, we already have virtual background segmented out. It's already in a feedback queue ready to go. So one of the ways that we can begin to both analyze and build insights around this is the idea of kind of relative change, to look at how things are comparing with virtual background versus prior months or compared to other product functionality areas. And in this case is what we're looking at. And so the thing I thought, in conversating with the product team before and my understanding of what was interesting to them was to do a quick comparison to prior month. And right now what I've done is set up a real quick look at June, which is the month we're in, compare it to May. And what I can see here is that in June, virtual background, the key product feature, the key roadmap item rather, that the product team is primarily focused on, has seen a very significant jump in mentions in June. So number one, that's a great story I can begin to tell. Now I just have to figure out the right other insights to bring to it, but it's definitely a takeaway that is going to be great to build upon because we want to make sure that we can highlight this succinctly, but the key area that the product team was interested in, virtual background, has a big jump in mentions. So the second component of that is trying to unpack as much as possible, what does that mean? What is, can I find anything out about those mentions of virtual background um, that might be more than just providing, comments or anecdotal feedback? And in this case, when I click on virtual background and I'm looking at June here, as I see on the right, I'm looking at comments. It actually becomes really apparent to me very quickly when I read these comments that the mentions around virtual background are not things, perhaps common in a product environment, like my virtual background doesn't work, or I wish it did this. But in actuality, these are feature requests. These are people, um, you know, please let us enable the custom background, which works only in PC. Please add virtual background. Uh, please give virtual background on mobile. Uh, virtual background in all mobile devices. Lost the feature of, so it's very quickly. Now, I work in the insights team. I probably have some understanding that the virtual background feature is not enabled in mobile, but it's also really easy for me to see this and to be able to draw this out. And furthermore, I can grab easily a couple quotes that help best tell that story. So, for my own insights, I'm going to pull a couple quotes and we'll save those for later. And the last thing I probably want to do is just understand, is there any outside trending to virtual background? Did it go up or down did it go up just in June, or was this an outlier? I can see this below that the trend did start to rise a little bit in May. So you can see I'm looking at the virtual background theme for Zoom. I can see that it did go from 1.6% of mentions in April to 2% in May to 2.7% in June. So it did rise. I think for the purpose of my story and what I'm trying to kind of convey to the product team, it's not as critical that I talk about this change from May to June as much as it is from April to May, as much as it is that I just highlight that big shift from May to June and talk about how this theme change and the change in volume is probably the biggest single area. Okay, so now that I have my roadmap item, the really the big one that the product team is interested in, we can talk about emerging themes. I know that was another one that the team was interested in looking at. And so interestingly enough, if I go to June, I can actually see that there's no emerging themes that pop out, none of these rare themes, which are very granular themes. And that's actually okay. One of the things I've sort of understood from my prior work with the product team is like, it's better not to force some of those analytics on them, better to let the story emerge naturally. I do remember from working with them over December and January, how during the holiday season, we were able to surface insights within Zoom about a lot of people talking about connecting with family and friends. That was something that built a lot of credibility with the product team. And so, we've gained a lot of credibility by surfacing emerging themes very carefully. We haven't done it all the time, and it's more been very carefully and surgically when we felt it was relevant. We did see in April and May profile picture increases in May and battery drain issues, definitely functionality and usability concerns. So we felt like these are worth surfacing just as insights to the team. We probably won't push this too much. Again, it's not part of the main story. We don't want to distract from the core piece around virtual background. And then the last piece was around anything else we think is relevant, particularly around usability. And this one is, I think, one of the greatest callouts we can probably give to the team. And that is that if we look at the score change between May and June, we can see that the app review scores did go up a little bit. But the biggest reason for that increase in score was actually usability improvements. Essentially what's happening here is that less people who are responding to app review feedback are mentioning usability concerns. And even when they do mention usability, this average scores are increasing. And we see this in areas like, people talking about the app being slow, or people talking about login and password issues. Those are actually improving. Even though they're negatively connotated themes, they're actually improving. And the reason that this is so important is that the product team historically has their own roadmap, they've got their own agenda, and so they're not natural adopters to things like app review ratings or NPS feedback. And so the more I can begin to align them to scores and feedback intertwined, particularly impact metrics like this, on something we know matters to them, the better things will be, I think, to help build that case over time. So I'm definitely going to grab this and try and craft this into our story. Okay. So I'm going to go back here and talk through now what does that quick sort of final readout look like, with the assumption that with a product team, head of product, I probably only have maybe 30 minutes to account for questions, conversation. So I don't want to overwhelm with slides. I want to be very succinct, want to get my point across. So the first thing is focusing on virtual background. Right away, I want to highlight that the mentions of virtual background increased 35% month over month, which is the actual sticking point number. And that I really want to highlight that they increased among all product functionality areas. It's critical because this is a roadmap item. So if I can hammer that home and hammer home that this indicates, the user feedback indicates it's a feature request, I'm beginning to tie all of these things in to the fact that it was a roadmap area. And I've gotten a couple, what I feel are really good quotes from customers, put them right back in there for them to have as part of the deck. Emerging themes called out front and center. I think in this case, it's probably good to just make the read. We don't have anything for June, but we did see these in prior months. They remain small. We'll continue to monitor. I do know that the product team is pretty technical. They're pretty analytical. They like data. Or they're at least data literate and savvy. So it's okay for me to put in these slides, these images. They've seen these before. Again, I can explain these pretty quickly, and I know the readout team is going to be able to understand these pretty intuitively. The volume and the percentage, it's pretty intuitive to see. And lastly, these other areas of interest, the fact that this is a primary driver of app review scores month over month, usability, and as I talked about before, this ties directly into something that's important to them, which is really, really critical for us to be able to influence some of those other things we're working on. Okay, so now moving on to the final step here, which is the idea of making the case. So one of the things that came from a lot of different conversations to us, from many of the different people we talked to, was this idea about, how do you build trust in what you're presenting? Was both having kind of like this ironclad understanding of the methodology, how it's collected, how you've analyzed it, because a lot of times you're going to get questions on that, particularly if people kind of don't like what you're presenting. The second bullet talks about if the data doesn't match their expectations, sometimes stakeholders have already heard things about data that may be wrong. One of our customers mentioned how they were presenting to a stakeholder and they had seen a customer data point that had been erroneously doubled in prior years. And so the first conversation they had to spend just kind of backtracking on a number that was provided wrong in prior years. So just having ironclad understanding of how things were conducted, bringing transparency to the table, but then also aligning the data to other projects of those stakeholders. So if I know I'm trying to influence somebody and I don't have much interaction with them, can I look at any other projects that they've been doing, any other things they've worked on, and try and align the data sets that we have, the feedback we have, to those projects and come to the table with a set of insights on things that they already believe in. That has, in multiple cases, people have talked about that as sort of like pro forma analysis, to basically prove value to somebody in advance of something that they already believe in prior to basically going in with an ask. Then about the message, sort of starting with the why are we here? I think one of the things the conversations talked about is a lot of times we go in with the data and we're so excited to present the data, we don't articulate the why enough, right? We are restating the problem in some of our more in-depth business case presentations. Definitely focusing on the key callouts to reduce the noise, make sure everything is very easy to understand. And then the last piece, which I think is probably a really good learning for us at Thematic, which is speaking the language of the audience. And that a lot of times the stakeholders, they don't speak in terms of themes. They oftentimes don't even speak in the language of the customers. And so sometimes it's necessary to translate that into their own language. And we had talked about the concept of a curator of insights. Well, sometimes it's a translator of insights as well. And lastly, the close, the call to action. This idea that leaders are expecting you to come with a recommendation, not just an interpretation of data, that they're looking to you to tell them what to do. And in particular, they're looking for that recommendation to be about that core business problem that we've scoped out or focused in on in the beginning. We certainly can address some of those other emerging insights or those other things that we think may be relevant, but this core scope, the core recommendation, sort of centers back to that core business problem. And additionally, this idea that that came through was if we can align the recommendations with the incentives of the stakeholders. So one of the conversations came around like, are there operational incentives that stakeholders have to achieve? Can we look at aligning recommendations to those? Are there, customer experience incentives? Anything you can do to further align your recommendations to not only the language, but to their own operational things they're trying to deliver gets a chance for buy-in and skin in the game. And so this is a quick uh, example of what a potential closing slide might be that we're presenting back to the product team. 3 actions: prioritize the virtual background for mobile as part of the product update, and in particular, basically what we're telling them in that sub bullet there is 1A, that the insights team, we're gonna help you by tracking that feedback weekly and semi-weekly, and we'd also like to tie it to some of those usage metrics within the product. So we're gonna help you. We're not telling you to do something without us being involved. The second piece here is that we are going to continue to monitor emerging themes, but we're not bolding that because we don't want to focus most of the conversation, most of this takeaway on it. And then the third one is that we do continue want to track usability trends for continued declines. We will report those directly to the product team owners. Every one of those functionality items has a product owner, so we will take that on. The last piece of the takeaway is that we are going to build, or we have as part of this pack, constructed comment packets for every piece in here. So for the virtual background, we'll have a digest of comments that can be read. So when this deck gets taken and shared, somebody who reads this within the virtual background team who wants to read those comments will have the ability to do that. Same thing for some of the usability comments, same thing for some of those, battery drain comments as well. That's a really key learning, and I think a great thing that one of our team customers talked about, which is, the deck's going to be shared, your insights are going to be shared. You have to have and anticipate some of those sharings and make sure that those resources are planned for in advance. And then lastly, make sure as this deck or this pack gets shared, that people know that they can reach out to us for additional conversations in advance, so they're not sort of wondering what do they do if they'd like to learn more. Okay, hope that
Great.
was helpful. I will stop there.